agenda today. So we're going to go with Dr. Kacie McCarthy. She is going to be talking about economics behind estrus synchronization, executing successful estrus synchronization protocols. And I think you'll find that presentation certainly enjoyable. Dr. McCarthy joined our staff about a year ago. She's the cow-calf specialist at the Department of Animal Science located in Lincoln on campus. She has a teaching role as well. She teaches beef cow calf management and livestock management and range and pasture courses, and certainly has a strong interest in extension programs related to reproduction and nutrition interactions. So with that, Dr. McCarthy, if you would share, well, I will stop sharing my screen and allow those there that have your presentation to share, and we will kick off today getting started.
Thank you.
Yep.
You all don't mind, I'm going to leave my mask off so you guys in the back can hear me, because I start getting a little muffled with it. So welcome, good morning. Thank you for having me today. Look forward to talking to you all about tips for a successful synchronization program. I know we're moving into calving right now, but this is a great time to start thinking about where cows are at moving in to that next breeding season here pretty soon. So for today's outline, briefly just want to talk to you all about long-term benefits of synchronization programs, looking at some different tools that are available, and we'll work through a few of those today. There's a number of different protocols, so depending on what your breeding goals and objectives are, there's usually something for everyone, depending on what you want to do, how many times you want to run cows through the chute, and what your ultimate goals are there. And then we'll look at a few costs associated with some of these different programs. So want to get you guys started off with a question, and you guys can throw it in the chat and let me know, but how many utilize synchronization currently with your herd? Raise your hand high so I can see in the back. Okay, we've got about 8 or so here. If you want to raise your hand, I unfortunately can't see you because of share screen, but I'm sure those of you online, if you do utilize it. So we've got a handful. So hopefully this will get you guys thinking about maybe how you might be able to implement some of these different technologies with your guys' herds now, or maybe some future herds, depending on where you're at. So less than 8% of US beef producers utilize artificial insemination. So why do you think that is so low? Anyone have a guess? More work? Okay, anybody else? Time, yes. Okay, great. So according to, this is some older NOMS data, but we're seeing a very similar percentage with the newer survey that came out. But the number one reason producers don't use AI or some type of estrus synchronization is time and labor. So you guys nailed it. So when we break that down a little further, roughly 7.9% of operations use estrus synchronization. That only about 7.6% will utilize AI. So, so when you think about how that breaks down, there's a lot of different strategies. Not everyone has to use AI when you're synchronizing, and you can use synchronization with live natural cover bulls as well. So there's a lot of different options besides just using AI as one of the technologies we'll talk about today. So when we break that down, you guys nailed it on the head. Time and labor are going to be your highest percent of operations that are not using synchronization due to time and labor. we start looking at the breakdown for cost. Facilities is going to play a big role in how many times you can run animals through the chute and what different protocols you'll be using. And so some of that is due to the reasons why people aren't utilizing some of these technologies. Understanding what you need to do and when you need to give a particular hormone to initiate that estrous cycle. And so understanding it, and this is a great opportunity to work, put a little plug here, with your beef educators, with your AI technicians, with a specialist. This is a great opportunity to learn more about what these programs and protocols can do and get a better understanding for what your guys' goals are. A lot of people have seen too that it just doesn't work. Well, Travis is going to talk today about how important nutrition is moving through calving and into that breeding season. And there are a lot of other factors that are going to play a role in how successful your guys' protocols are. So when we break this down even further, looking at our heifers and our cows, a large percentage of our operations are utilizing exposure to bulls. So they're live cover and using bulls. Well, we have a small percentage that's actually using AI and then covering those cows with bulls. Maybe we're just using AI, or maybe we're just breeding and buying females from somebody else. So there's a wide variety of options depending on what stage you're in. If you're wanting just to look at bull exposure, or maybe we're thinking about heifer development. And Dr. Cushman will be talking a little bit about how we can manage heifers and dry locks later today, and looking at some of these different options and responses. So when we're utilizing bulls and utilizing estrus synchronization, one way that we can use estrus sync or synchronization is to alter that calving season. And so we have that bull power that we're still wanting to utilize, but maybe we want to shorten or condense our calving season. Maybe we want to decrease the length of it, or maybe we just want to target some of those later calving cows and start them cycling sooner because they're later in that calving season and we need to jumpstart them. And so these are some tools where we can target specific groups of animals depending on what your guys' objectives are. Synchronization with bulls has that potential to increase the number of females bred earlier and sooner in that breeding season. And so more than 90% of producers don't utilize AI. We saw that by the numbers, but this is a great way to change or condense that breeding season and still use the bull battery we have. So what is an ideal synchronization protocol? We're going to dive into some different ones here a little later, but what are your goals? What do you want out of utilizing synchronization? Well, this is a great way to get a higher number of females responding to that treatment. So how do we do that? There's going to be some nutrition and some other management things we'll talk about later that are going to help have a successful protocol. We don't want to impact fertility. We want to have high conception rates, but maybe we can utilize a protocol to increase that genetic potential by utilizing specific bulls that maybe are a little different than what we have in our bull battery. Maybe we want to utilize synchronization to reduce the number of times we're moving animals through the chute, but then we're having an opportunity to pick up some of those non-cyclic females. So depending on what you want, there's different protocols to be able to help meet that ideal protocol that you're looking for. So what do we need to know? Well, we'll show you some tools today to help with a well-planned program. A couple different planners and calendars where you just plug and chug what you want in there, and it spits back when you need to bring cows in, when you need to give them a shot, when you might need to pull a CIDR if you're using a CIDR protocol. And then, do you want to breed in the morning? Maybe you want to breed at night. Maybe you want to avoid the 4th of July. And so how do we manage and have animals running through the chute? And so we can provide some tools for that to set up a successful program. Travis is going to talk about it later today, but understanding where our cows are at in terms of body condition score, that nutrition moving into breeding season. If these cows are out on pasture, are they on lower quality forage, or maybe we're spiking up in terms of forage quality and availability. And so these girls are in a great plane of nutrition moving into breeding season. But understanding where those cows are at and the timing of breeding will be very important. Have you talked to your vet in terms of pre-breeding vaccinations? So this ensuring that these cows have had their vaccinations at least 30 days prior to that breeding season. We won't dive into that today, but we can see some impacts depending on the type of vaccines that we're administering right before that breeding season. So making sure we're disease-free. This is another opportunity to get our bulls checked as well. If we are throwing bulls out for live cover, make sure they're disease-free and they're ready to go for the breeding season. Have we checked our working facilities, our pens, our chutes, our alleys? This is another opportunity, depending on how many times we're running animals through the chute, making sure that we have good working facilities. This is also another opportunity to look at records. Maybe we're trying to target breeding our specific heifers, or maybe we want to look at our 2- and 3-year-old cows and increase that genetic potential within those females. So having some good records so we know who we're identifying, what programs and protocols we're going through. And then if we're using a heat detection protocol, understanding the signs to look for. So we'll dive into that for some of you that might not be familiar with some of those estrus and heat detection protocols. So what are some potential advantages for estrus synchronization programs? Well, the first one, and I mentioned this a little earlier, concentrating that breeding season. So this is a great opportunity for us to have a more uniform calf crop, condense potentially if we need to, that calving period. We're going to concentrate that labor, but then ultimately we're going to have more uniform calves at the end of the day when it comes to weaning time. Depending on if we are using an AI program with heat detection, we can vary that time and labor component depending on which protocol we're going to pick. So we'll go into that, but heat detection is going to add a little bit more time to actually observe those females, take notes, and see who we need to pull in terms of breeding at heat detection. But there's some other options where we can do a fixed time. So we want to breed and we want to start breeding at 8 a.m. So then we can backtrack and plan for that breeding time. And so there's some advantages to some different protocols depending on what you guys are wanting to do. This also allows us to use some of those more superior bulls via AI or even natural service. We might be able to target a specific number of females to AI to a particular bull, and then we can cover those females with natural service. This also allows us to have calves that ultimately data has found that these calves are on average 13 days older and roughly 21 pounds heavier than those non-synchronized females in the study from Schaefer and others in the 90s. And we've seen that over the years where, again, going back to concentrating that breeding season, more uniform calf crop, we have older and heavier calves sooner in that breeding season. So what are some long-term benefits of utilizing some of these different programs? Dr. Cushman, who will be on later today, did quite a bit of research here just down the road at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, where they looked at improving longevity and that genetic merit in those replacement females. And the research here from Nebraska clearly demonstrates that the value of those females conceiving in that first 21 days over that breeding season, we start to see they are retained in that herd longer, and they're producing calves, more pounds of calf, and they're staying over that lifetime of their production cycle in the herd longer. And so you can see those females with the solid bar are retained in that herd for a longer period of time compared to those females that are conceiving after that second or third cycle of gestation. So we're seeing some long-term benefits with those females and utilizing some of these technologies. When we dive a little deeper into some different studies looking at AI or natural service, we're also seeing those similar impacts and effects with artificial insemination. And so we're seeing that females that are born earlier with AI are producing heavier calves at yearling weights. Their age at first AI is higher, and then they're actually, we're seeing a similar postpartum interval for those females, but we're also producing more pounds of calf at yearling time. When we also look at that lifetime weight of those calves weaned from the same study, we're seeing similar ages at weaning, but we see that we're producing more pounds of calf to AI compared to natural service. So there are some benefits, and they've seen that over that lifetime of those females, that they're producing roughly 2 more calves per productivity than some of those females that are conceiving natural service. So we see a 699-pound difference in that lifetime weight weaned, and then, like I mentioned, that 2 pounds or 2 calves more with AI. So this just kind of drives home that idea when we were talking about some of those different benefits of utilizing different synchronization protocols, but this is a timed artificial insemination protocol on the percentage of cows calving. And so you can take a look here. Along the x-axis, we see days of calving season. And so they break them down into every 10 days. And so you see that our timed AI is going to be in those gray bars, and then those controls, which are going to be natural service, are going to be in that red. And we're seeing a majority of those females, even in that first 21 days, they're calving more. A percentage are calving more in the first 21 days. And then we're also seeing that on calving and weaning, we see more calves. 44% of those calves that are born to timed AI, there's roughly about 20% more calves compared to those controlled natural service calves. So we're seeing a lot sooner in that calving season. Just breaking this down into a different table for you guys to see. When we look at the comparison between the control and the timed AI, we see that there's a greater percent of weaning rates in those roughly, what is that? We're seeing about 38 pounds of, I was trying to do the math, but I forgot I had these fancy little button boxes here, but 38-pound differential in that calf weaning weight for timed AI. And then ultimately that comes down to about $49 a cow between these two different protocols, and looking at the return and investment for those cows. So do we have any questions so far? Now we're going to kind of dive into some of those tools and looking at some of the protocols. But ultimately, I wanted to set the stage for some of those impacts that we've seen utilizing these different synchronization strategies. So the first resource, there's no questions, and I'm looking, not seeing anything on Zoom. But the Beef Reproductive Task Force is a group of researchers, extension professionals related to beef reproduction and developing these different protocols and providing a number of different resources. And so we'll be able to share these links with you all. But some of the protocols that we'll be talking about today, this group develops and does research on a number of these different protocols and looks at the longevity, our pregnancy rates related to these different protocols. And so a lot of great resources on this page, and our extension website also has a link to that page as well. So the first tool that I want to talk about, and the next couple slides, I threw an example in just so you kind of get an idea of what this synchronization calendar can do for you. But this is a downloadable Excel spreadsheet, and what it provides is a worksheet, a calendar, a printout sheet. So then it tells you exactly when you need to give a particular shot, when you need to turn bulls in, when you need to pull CIDRS, when you're AIing, depending on what time and what protocol you're choosing. So the link is here. We can also throw those in the chat as well. And then the B3 Pro website under their resources tab has this link available. They just collect your name and email, and then they'll provide the link to you. So when we break down our planner, it's got a lot of different fill-in options within the sheet, but it's great. I use it in class with my students as well, working through different scenarios. And so what you can do is you can add your name. If you're working with multiple pastures, you can have whatever information you want here that you add up in the top right. And then we start adding some of these inputs. And so breed type, you're going to either do Bos Taurus or Bos Indicus. You throw that in. There's different protocols depending on your breed type. So if we're down in Texas or maybe down in the South and we've got a little more Bos Indicus influenced cattle, there's going to be a couple different protocols that we're going to get some different responses with. So understanding the type of cattle you're working with will be important when you're entering that data here. Then what's your system type? Do you want estrus AI? Or are we going to estrus AI and then clean up with artificial insemination? Or are we going to do a fixed time AI? So then we can plug that system in there. Then it gives us, I'll show you on the next slide, a list of different protocols that you can choose from. And that big list, they number it. They number it here, and then they provide some different options and then a cost breakdown for you as well. So when we then move down into the time of day, so like I mentioned, if you want to breed at night, if you want to breed super early in the morning, you can give that option, and it'll spit out a time for when you need to do all your other your shots and working events. And then you can choose a couple different options for GnRH and our prostaglandin, and then it spits out your outputs here for expected calving dates, when this protocol I chose has a CIDR, and so when you need to remove that, how many trips through that chute, and then you can also do a cost comparison with a couple different options of protocols. So if you want to do something with the CIDR and without, you can throw those in that alternative system comparison, and it'll spit out a cost comparison for you. So what that looks like here, you just scroll down in that spreadsheet. It gives you different options for fixed time AI was one of the options I chose. It gives you a preferred and less preferred. So then it starts thinking about cost, number of times you're running animals through the chute, and the time depending on which protocol you're wanting. This little See Protocols button, you can click on that and it'll take you back to the list of protocols that you have. And so you can always go back if you're a little more visual and wanting to know exactly when certain shots are, you can look at that big protocol sheet. Then it breaks it down depending on how many cattle you have, that labor charge, and that cost estimate. If you're throwing and using an MGA product, then that'll look at that cost for that protocol as well. So you can break that down and look at a few different costs associated with the number of times and number of doses, CIDRS, and semen costs. You can add all that here in the spreadsheet. One other tool that's available on the resources page for the Beef Reproductive Task Force is the AI calculator. And basically working through this, you put in your natural service sire cost. So how much did your bull cost? How long are you going to have them? What's that salvage value? Then you can look at artificial insemination costs. And so you add in that labor and cost for semen. And then it does some comparisons for you, depending on the number of cows you have. And this can be downloaded on your smartphone as well, if you're interested in a system like that. We here at UNL also have a breeding cost calculator, which you can go to the link here on our farm and ranch management extension page and plug into this Excel spreadsheet your general natural service costs associated here, how much your bull costs are, how old your bulls are, how long you're having them for, and then you can do the same kind of comparison there with artificial insemination costs. So those are available, and that's another Excel spreadsheet that's available to you all. So I want to dive in towards the later part of today's talk, thinking about what are some of those specific estrus synchronization protocols, and what might be some of the benefits to utilizing some of these different protocols. So what does synchronization really mean? Can anybody tell me? What does it mean to synchronize? Get them grouped, right? This thing. A pretty good definition? I think so. So basically it's manipulating that cow's estrus cycle. So all of those cows within the herd, or a majority of those cows within the herd, are going to be cycling at the same time. So like you said, you're trying to group those animals. And so when we talk back to condensing or maybe shortening those cycles and non-cyclic cows, there's a lot of options for what we can do by manipulating that estrus cycle. So what are some of those main hormones when we're thinking about reproduction in our beef cattle? So we've got GnRH, which releases FSH and LH. That's follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We need these to be able to ovulate, to be able to generate new follicles that ultimately lead to that ovulation and hopefully conception. So FSH develops it, LH is going to help at ovulation. We're going to see a huge spurge of LH at ovulation. And so we're trying to manipulate these different hormones. Then we have estradiol. This is that estrus behavior that we're seeing. That's going to be that spike in estrogen. Then we're going to have progesterone. This is our maintenance of pregnancy hormone. This is what keeps these females happy for a long time, right? We're keeping that baby and that fetus happy, and it's preventing ovulation from occurring. So we'll talk about some of our CIDRS. That's going to give a slow release of that progesterone, and then we're going to pull it, and then we're going to see that spike in ovulation because it's preventing that ovulation from occurring. And then we're going to have prostaglandin, which is going to lyse our CL. So that's our corpus luteum. That's ultimately what's going to release that egg, and then we're going to have ovulation. And so we also see spikes in prostaglandin. That's smooth muscle contractions. When we start calving, we're going to see that uterus is working, and we're going to see those smooth muscles contracting to help with parturition as well. So it does a lot of different things, but when we're thinking about manipulating that estrus cycle, this product also comes into play. So I want to just give you guys an idea again of thinking about our estrus cycle. We're going to have ovulation occurring, and then we're going to basically regenerate that cycle. So we're going to go through, we're going to have our follicles developing, we're going to have our LH and FSH, and we're going to have that spike in LH right before ovulation occurs again. And we're going to see that spike in estrogen as well, because then we're going to have that estrus response and standing behavior and ultimately ovulation. And so most of the time we're looking at a 3-wave cycle. So we have follicles that are growing throughout that cycle. So we have all those hormones that are developing our follicles. And so they're going through and we see these waves. And so ultimately what we want to do with some of our hormones and manipulating that cycle is understanding, depending on where these females are in their wave or cycle, we can try and target some of these more dominant follicles that you're going to see in the middle of their cycle, and we can try and target one of those dominant follicles and initiate ovulation, which ultimately in a normal cycle is going to occur after three waves of that follicle development. So what do we need? What are some of those keys to have a successful synchronization? So when we're thinking about our heifers, making sure that those heifers are pubertal. And so we're targeting those heifers roughly around that 13 to 15 months of age. We're not going to dive into heifer development today, but if you're having a target % of body weight in those females, if we're targeting a mature body weight, anywhere from 50 to 65% of mature body weight, that's going to land those heifers roughly around that year of age and into 15 months. If we're thinking about our female cows, so our mature cows, we talked about those non-cycling cows. So we can utilize some of these strategies, say like a CIDR, which we can get some of those females that might be in shorter postpartum, where we can get them, those non-cycling females moved up. So we usually try and target at least 50 days postpartum and a body condition score of 5, because then we're going to be asking a lot of these females too around breeding season with peak lactation and some other demands. And so ensuring that these females are in adequate body condition moving into breeding season will help with that success of some of these protocols. And even if we're utilizing natural service. If we're synchronizing heifers, we can utilize an MGA product. And so this is a fed product. And the biggest thing with MGA is ensuring we have plenty of bunk space and that all these females are eating it. So we've had to feed this product a couple times a day, depending on the bunk space, how many females we have consuming that product. And so making sure that cattle are hungry, they're going to consume it, will help with the success of that product in synchronization. Again, I talked about understanding where your cattle are at in terms of those pre-breeding vaccinations. That's going to be critical, so we're not seeing any other effects with maybe a modified live vaccine right before breeding season. And then one other fun little note, especially if cows are getting bored, I've seen it a lot in the dry lot, where if we've got that fun little blue string sticking out with our cows, and if it's pretty far, those cows like to pull and eat and chew on them and pull them out. So I usually try and recommend cutting that string to a couple inches, enough so you can grab it, but they can't get bored and pull it out, or else the efficacy of that protocol ultimately doesn't work because they don't have a CIDR. So just a few tips to help with the success of some of those protocols. If we're using natural service and we're using estrus synchronization, I do like to recommend that we are getting those bulls checked for breeding soundness exams prior to that breeding season and giving them plenty of time before breeding if you guys do need to recheck them. So if we're working with some of those yearling bulls, making sure those scrotal circumferences meet that minimum. And then if we're using younger bulls, understanding what that bull to cow ratio is going to be if we do want to stick them out with some females that are synchronized. It's going to be a lot of work early for some of those younger bulls. So we like to decrease that ratio roughly around that 18:1 to 20:1 ratio for some of those younger bulls, just because they're going to have to work a lot and they're still trying to figure things out. Our more mature bulls, if we can throw those guys out on females, usually they can get the job done with a lot of that concentrated work early on in that breeding season. When we're using a couple different bulls, understanding just where your bulls are at, how you're allocating those bulls, depending on if you're needing to throw those out with heifers or maybe your mature cows, and just so understanding that demand that those bulls will be on if we're utilizing synchronization. So talked about a couple of different hormones earlier. So the three main ones that we're using in some of these protocols are going to be prostaglandin, progestins, and then GnRH. And so these are what we're going to see in a lot of our different protocols. When we're thinking about utilizing our bulls for natural service, we can still use a prostaglandin or some of these other hormones if we're wanting to synchronize these females. Maybe at day 0 or day 5, we can pull all those females in, give them a shot, and then send them out, and we can manipulate that cycle and get a concentrated number of females to cycle earlier in their cycle during that breeding season. So these are great tools depending on what we're trying to do. So prostaglandin, again, like I said, causes that regression of our corpus luteum. This has no effect on our estrus cattle. So if you've got those later cycling cows, we're going to need something a little stronger than just giving her a shot of PG. So we don't see that jump start, like I mentioned, in some of those females that might be close to coming out of estrus. And prostaglandin is only effective during like day 6, so right after estrus, and then later and into about day 16 of the cycle. So you can see it here where we've got the regression. So it doesn't work here, but we're seeing that regression here of those follicles from day 6 to 16-ish, and then we see ovulation again. Some of those different products, there's a lot of different brand names out there. And so that's going to be just talking with your AI tech or your veterinarian on what's available, and then understanding the dosage, because there is some differences with doses depending on which product you choose. So that's going to be pretty important when you're thinking about how many times animals need to come through the chute, and then what shot you're actually giving and how much. So Lutulise and Estromate are going to be probably your two popular ones, depending on what your vet carries. And then when we're thinking about our GnRH products, this is usually given at a single injection at any random stage will result in an LH surge. So our PG doesn't do that, but our GnRH will. And so we're seeing that our GnRH is going to lyse, or we're going to see that ovulation in those larger follicles. So we're targeting those larger follicles that are real close to ovulating. And so we will see a turnover, and we can jumpstart that cycle depending on where they're at in their wave. We can jumpstart those follicles. So prostaglandin will regress GnRH induced CL 7 days later. So the timing of when we're giving these products is going to be very important. So following our calendar that we talked about will be really helpful. But GnRH is one that can help jumpstart some of those females. So if we have some of those females that are still in estrus, or maybe we've got a handful of females that by the time we turn the bull out, we want to get them cycling sooner, we can give them a shot of GnRH and we can jumpstart those cycles. And so then we start to see that ovulation sooner than having to wait that 21 days for that full cycle. So just to kind of illustrate that here, how does it work? How does it induce ovulation? So you're giving that GnRH shot, roughly 2 to 4 hours later, we're going to see that surge and release of LH. So remember, that's that big surge that we normally see in a 21-day cycle where it spikes and then we have ovulation. So we're basically trying to emulate that same thing, but no matter where in that cycle, we can get that LH surge target. We don't see estrus And then 20 to 30 hours later, then we're seeing that ovulation. And so if cattle have a large healthy follicle, ovulation will be induced approximately that 24 to 30 hours after that injection. So some of those products that you might have seen on the shelf or maybe you have at home, we're going to have Cistrulline, Factrol, Fergadol, and Ovacist are just a handful of those products. And what's nice about that planner is depending on what product and you have available, you can plug that in and it'll spit out that dosage that you need depending on the protocol you choose. So you'll either get a couple cc's or maybe 5 cc's depending on the product that you're using. So progestins was that third hormone that I talked about. These will block ovulation. So thinking about kind of that birth control, that pregnancy mimic of our hormone. So progestins can jumpstart a female. So I talked about some of our non-cycling late calvers. This is another tool that you can use if we want to target that specific group of cows and jumpstart those cycles. So these are going to be either our CIDR, which is a controlled internal drug release, and usually the protocols are either about 7 or 14 days, depending on which protocol you choose. Or we have MGA, which is a fed product, and this is for heifers only. And so understanding the dosage and going back to understanding bunk space and getting those females all to eat it will be important for the success of that protocol. So this is just some quick data I want to throw in here, but ultimately to back up that idea that CIDRS can help stimulate estrous cycles, particularly in those late low progesterone cows. This was a study from Lamb and others in 2001, looking at pregnancy rates. And so jumpstarting those females and initiating a reset in some of those late calving cows, CIDRS is a great tool for that. So again, when we're thinking about those protocols, there's heat detection, there's ones with CIDRS that we talked about, fixed time AI. So there's a lot of different options. The next one that we're going to go into are going to be more of these protocols up here in the top with heat detection. So when we think about what heat is and understanding that's going to be a little bit of extra time and labor to monitor these females, but heat is that short period of receptivity. So these are going to be those open females and heifers. They're displaying estrus. So this is going to be, and it all varies with females, anywhere from 8 to 18 hours. But this is where they're standing, and we're seeing those receptivity behaviors for heat detection. So when we're monitoring this, what are some of the signs we need to look for? Can anybody tell me, you're going to go out and look at some of the cows you're syncing up, what are signs you're looking for heat detection? Swollen vulva, great. She's riding other females, or other females are riding her, depending on where she's at, right? Okay, good. Anybody else? Great, these are great. So basically this is standing heat. So we're looking at those behaviors. Those females are either receptive to mounting, or maybe those females are coming into heat, and so now they're getting really active. They don't want to go eat, they want to start riding females. And so you can look at those signs. Definitely recommend, if you're trying to heat detect, do it after you feed or before you feed. Because if you're feeding females, then basically your observations are going to get all out of whack, because those girls really want to go eat instead of worrying about what they need to do and who they need to go ride. So do understand that either before feeding or after, once those females kind of settle down after eating, it'll be a good time to observe those females. So what are some of those secondary characteristics? So we talked about mounting. We talked about swollen vulvas. They're really friendly. Maybe they're a little restless or nervous. And maybe we're also seeing some of that mucus discharge, roughened tail head. We'll talk about some different patches and things, but if you're utilizing some other technologies to help you detect estrus, you'll start seeing some of that roughened tail head and some of these other secondary characteristics. And yep, swollen vulva, knew it was on the list. And so if we do see blood or a bloody mucus, this is basically telling us that female was in heat. And sometimes we'll see a bloody mucus after breeding. And so basically that's that kind of flush right after heat or ovulation. So it's kind of hard. Some of you guys online can see it, but you can see just kind of that red bloody discharge here in the photo. I know in the back it's kind of hard to see. But when we're thinking about heat detection, this is going to be a big time commitment. One, you should probably be checking a couple times a day and sitting out there for about 20 to 30 minutes, because then we're seeing a lot of different activity. Sometimes we're just seeing some regular head pressing, but then other times we're actually seeing some of those secondary characteristics and mounting activities. So this will give you a really good idea who truly is in heat, or maybe who's coming into heat. And so writing some of those notes down, but it's going to take a little bit of time. So if you have it, or maybe you got some students or kids that want to go do some heat detection, it's a great use of your time. But knowing the signs. So most accurate is that standing female that is being ridden. So that's that ear tag number that you want to write down. That most of that from the research, we're seeing that occurring 60 to 70% of the time is going to be at night. Then we're seeing most of that, about 25% is around that 8 hour. But like I said, that heat detection and that standing heat can be a long period of time in some females. So if you're observing it, write some notes, watch that behavior. But usually it's going to be within that 12 to 18 hours. One way to help, like I mentioned, is utilizing some type of visual aid. If that's going to be a chalk, if that's going to be an estrus detection patch, that can help you, with the number of mounts and observations. You can see when some of those females are getting ridden, and then ultimately when they're standing in heat. So tail chalking is one. The different detection patches. So this is going to be like an estrus or estrus detection patch. We've got technologies that'll send a text to your phone, or you can look on a big data sheet that comes in and tells you, hey, we're seeing a lot of activity. There's ear tags and the dairies use. So there's a lot of different aids. And so there's different pedometers and chin ball markers. We also have females that are injected with testosterone, or maybe we've got goner bulls that we're throwing out there to watch some of this detection. A lot of different resources, and then understanding if we're using our patches, what that difference is in terms of estrus response. And so we're looking for, I should have done like A, B, or C, had you guys tell me, who do we want to breed out of the top here? Which one do we want to target? The bottom one? Yeah. So we're wanting to see a patch that has at least 5 or more mountings. So this is somebody that's been exhibiting those secondary estrus signs. So that's a great way for a visual aid. There's those different technologies that I said where you're putting big patches and they're sending data to you. You can do the chalk. The K-Mars are a little older product, and so that would just basically it pops and then the red distributes after so many mountings. So a lot of different products. depending on what we're wanting to use for heat detection. I also like using these products, even if we're using like a fixed time AI protocol. This just helps kind of gauge what our response rate was for those females that were synchronizing. So even if you're saying, I want to breed these females at 6 in the morning, but I want to know how many females actually responded to our protocol, these are great. Sometimes if you have that flexibility, maybe we breed some of those females that didn't respond, or maybe are just starting to come into heat. Maybe we target AI them just a day later, or maybe 12 hours later, depending on what that response is. So there's some options depending on that flexibility you have. Number of different protocols for cows and for heifers. And like I mentioned, if you're working with more Boston Nicus females, there's also been some work with researchers looking at some of these different protocols. So what does fixed time AI mean? What do you guys think it means? Do it on a schedule. Yes, exactly. So depending on what works with your schedule, or maybe your technician can only come in on Sunday or Tuesday afternoon, how do you backtrack to be able to target that time that you need to get these animals bred? So this is basically synchronizing. We're synchronizing all of those cows, but we're wanting to breed at a specific time. So theoretically, these animals are all ovulating at the same time, but we do know that we have different responses, but we're trying to target a majority of those females and breed at a particular time. So run through here just a few of those different costs associated with these different protocols. I'd be here all day if we really dove into each specific protocol. I do have some of those listed in the back of slides that are going to be posted online. And if you guys do have questions about particular protocols, we can dive into those a little later. But just want to run through a few different costs. Depending on the protocol, a lot of that is going to vary. It vary in terms of conception rates, vary in terms of costs, and number of times we're moving those animals through the chute. So being able to do some different comparisons, there's been quite a bit of work. And this was a nice summary from Sally Johnson from the Beef Task Force group, looking at different conception rate percentages with timed AI. And we're seeing roughly around that 50 to 60%. So we're targeting about 50 to 60% of those females are going to conceive to AI. And then the rest of those females then basically would either need to have a second round of AI done, or you're allowing those bulls to cover those females' natural service. When we're thinking about the costs, so a lot of what plays into that cost and that time and labor is going to be that number of days that you're working those females. And so how many times do they come through the chute? What type of products are you using? How many times do you need to give them a shot? And we're seeing those preg rates still around that 50 to 60%. And the time and labor is going to vary as well. And usually this was utilizing 2 bulls with 100 head of cows. You're getting 50% of those females. And that cost ranges anywhere from $40 to $60 per pregnancy. So there's a few other additional costs when we think about utilizing AI that we need to account with some of these protocols. If you're thinking about utilizing AI, and a lot of that is going to be in, this was about 16 years ago. So that semen cost is going to change depending on what bulls you're using. We're seeing anywhere for $20 to $25 a straw now, and then what that costs for dosage for if we're using a CIDR or not, in our PG and our GnRH products, and then ultimately we're looking at about 175 plus cost per unit when we start adding in some of those additional costs. But on that last side, you do see if we're just utilizing some of those natural service systems, we're seeing a lower cost for those pregnancies.
So there's a lot of different options depending on which combinations you want. This was a summary from Brent Plugi and others here in Nebraska, looking at heifer synchronization, bred to AI or natural service. These females were fed MGA for 14 days, and then you wait 19 days, and then you give them a PG post MGA. And so we could see they had 80 heifers in both of those groups. 95% were in estrus within that first 6 days. And we see roughly about 70% in that first 30 days were pregnant, and about 83 natural service. So, you know, AI, if you are thinking this is a particular point in time that we're breeding these females, natural service, that bull's going to be breeding those females a couple times at least. And so a little different in terms of what we're seeing for response, but still a large majority of those females were pregnant in that first 30 days. So just wanted to wrap up here, give you guys some things to think about when we start moving into some of our nutritional impacts that Travis will talk about moving into breeding season, and how we can manipulate these cycles. But ultimately, nutrition, our body condition, Travis will touch on that a little bit today, and then understanding where our cows are at in terms of their postpartum interval. How we can manage those females depending on if they're late calvers or early calvers will really be critical for setting up a successful synch program, if that is something you're considering. When you do decide when you're utilizing these products, you get to decide when your cows become pregnant. So if you want to be able to go sit at the beach or something on you know, the 4th of July weekend, and so we're going to set those females up you know, a week before, you get to set that up. You get to figure out, you know, what genetics you might be utilizing if we're using AI. Then you're also thinking about how we can move and manipulate that calving and that breeding season by getting more cows pregnant earlier. We can also increase the pounds of calf that are born earlier, and the number of calves that we're having earlier in that calving season. And then ultimately, going back to those initial slides I talked about earlier today, those heifers that are born early in our calving season that we might be using for replacements, ultimately the data has shown that they have a greater lifetime productivity, and they stay in the herd longer if we're selecting those females that are born earlier, and also conceiving earlier within their lifetime. And basically what I hope you guys took away from today, there's a number of different synchronization protocols. And depending on what your guys' goals and objectives are, we can always tailor something to help meet those goals. And so I know there's a lot to choose from, but we can always start small and say, let's give all our cows a shot at PG, and we'll throw those bulls out. But we're still synchronizing and helping you move and shift that breeding season. And so if you have questions about any of the tools and resources I talked about today, I'd be happy to share those links and work through any of those with you. So with that, my contact information is here, and you can call my office or send me an email, and I will take any questions now, or I think we do have some time during the panel discussion this afternoon as well. So with that, I'll open the floor up. I don't know, Brent, how much time we have for questions.
Yeah, actually, we have just not very much time at this point for questions. I think we'll take those during the panel discussion, unless there's a really quick question you can answer from the group at this point. Okay, those of you that, oh, go ahead, Kacie.
No, I was going to say, I think everybody's got maybe saving questions for later. So you're good, Brent.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kacie. Wonderful information.